Some Victorian jobs guaranteed you'd die young. The Industrial Revolution created employment opportunities that were essentially death sentences. Children climbed chimneys that suffocated them. Women's jawbones rotted from matchmaking chemicals. Men drowned in sewage or were crushed by machinery. The death tolls were staggering. The Victorians knew these jobs were deadly. They did them anyway because starvation was the alternative. Before we dive in, subscribe to our channel to support us. Let's explore 15 forgotten Victorian jobs that were basically death sentences. Chimney sweeps, climbing boys, children as young as 4, were sent up chimneys barely 9 inches wide. Many suffocated, burned alive, or developed the first industrial cancer ever identified. The job requirements were simple: be small enough to fit in narrow chimneys. Boys were purchased from parents or workhouses, apprenticed to master sweeps, and forced up hot, twisted flues to scrape soot with their bare hands. Getting stuck was common. Chimneys were pitch black, filled with suffocating soot and confusing to navigate. Boys entered the wrong flue on the way down, became wedged with knees jammed under chins, and died slowly. When rescue attempts failed, walls were torn down to remove corpses. Masters sometimes lit fires below, stuck children to force them up faster. The choice was climb or burn. Many burned. Survivors faced chimney sweeps cancer, scrotal cancer from soot lodging in skin folds. Percival Pott identified it in 1725 as the first occupational cancer. The disease started as a painful sore, then spread through the testicles into the abdomen, killing slowly and painfully. The soot caused chronic lung disease, blindness from eye irritation, and skeletal deformities from climbing while bones were still developing. Working conditions created stunted, hunchbacked men with ruined lungs, if they survived to adulthood. Legislation starting in 1788 attempted to regulate the practice. The laws were ignored. In 1875, 12-year-old George Brewster suffocated in a chimney. His death finally prompted enforcement. He was the last recorded child chimney sweep death in Britain, after nearly a century of preventable deaths. Matchstick girls. Women and girls who made matches developed phossy jaw, a condition where their jawbones literally rotted away. The disease was entirely preventable. Factories used white phosphorus anyway because it was cheaper. The matchmaking process exposed workers to white phosphorus fumes for 10 to 14 hours daily. They dipped wooden sticks into heated phosphorus mixtures, then dried them in heated chambers filled with toxic vapor. The first symptom was toothache. Then came swollen gums and abscesses. The jawbone began dying, creating fistulas that drained pus through holes in the face. Teeth fell out. The necrotic bone glowed greenish-white in the dark. As the disease progressed, entire sections of jaw died and had to be surgically removed, without anesthesia in early cases. Even after jaw removal, the necrosis often spread to the brain, causing seizures, meningitis, and death. The smell of rotting bone and drainage was so severe that family members couldn't stay in the same room with victims. Patients were ostracized like lepers, called matchmakers' leprosy cases. About 11% of workers exposed to white phosphorus developed phossy jaw. The first case was diagnosed in 1839. By 1844, doctors had reported 22 cases and established white phosphorus as the cause. Alternative safer red phosphorus existed. Factory owners refused to use it because white phosphorus was cheaper and created strike-anywhere matches consumers preferred. In 1888, 1,400 women at Bryant and May factory struck against conditions. After 3 weeks, they won, abolishing fines and improving conditions. But white phosphorus wasn't banned in Britain until 1910, after decades of preventable suffering. Navvies, railway builders. Railway construction killed workers by the hundreds through explosions, landslides, tunnel collapses, and simple exhaustion. The work was brutal, the conditions were terrible, and the death rate was extraordinary. Navvies, short for navigators, built Britain's railways using picks, shovels, and dynamite. They moved millions of tons of earth manually, excavated tunnels through unstable rock, and worked with explosives without safety training. Dynamite accidents were common. Premature explosions buried workers or blew them apart. Tunnel collapses trapped dozens at a time. Landslides crushed workers beneath tons of earth and rock. The work itself could kill. Navvies worked 12 to 16-hour days doing back-breaking labor. Exhaustion, hernias, and heart attacks from overexertion were common causes of death. Living conditions spread disease. Navvies lived in temporary camps with poor sanitation, contaminated water, and overcrowding. Typhoid, cholera, and dysentery killed almost as many workers as accidents. No accurate death counts exist. Railway companies didn't track navvy deaths systematically. Estimates suggest thousands died building Britain's rail network, but the true number is unknown. Arsenic mill workers. Workers who ground arsenic for pigments and dyes breathed toxic dust constantly. The poisoning was slow, cumulative, and inevitably fatal. Arsenic created beautiful green pigments used in wallpaper, paint, fabric dyes, and artificial flowers. The bright green color was fashionable. Creating it required grinding arsenic compounds into fine powder. Workers in arsenic mills breathed the dust all day. The particles settled in their lungs, absorbed into their bloodstream, and accumulated in their tissues. The poisoning was chronic and irreversible. Early symptoms included headaches, digestive problems, and skin lesions. As poisoning progressed, workers developed nerve damage, organ failure, and cancer. Death could take years, but was nearly certain for long-term workers. The dust contaminated everything. Workers' homes became toxic. Their families developed arsenic poisoning from exposure to contaminated clothing and skin. Victorian homes were often decorated with arsenic. Here are the remaining 11 jobs to complete the script. Mudlarks. Children scavenged the Thames riverbanks at low tide, digging through sewage and industrial waste for anything sellable. They worked barefoot in freezing, toxic mud filled with sharp objects and disease. Mudlarks were typically between ages 6 and 15, too poor for other work. They waded through human waste, animal carcasses, and chemical runoff looking for coal, rope, nails, or bones to sell. The river mud contained raw sewage from millions of Londoners. Every cut or scrape, and there were many from broken glass, rusty metal, and sharp bones, risked infection. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery were constant threats. Drowning was common. Children working too far from shore got caught by rising tides. The mud itself was treacherous, dense, clinging, and capable of trapping victims who sank and suffocated. Winter work was particularly deadly. Standing in freezing sewage for hours caused hypothermia and frostbite. Many mudlarks developed chronic respiratory infections that killed them young. The work paid almost nothing. A good day might earn a few pence. Children did it because their families were starving, and any income was better than none. Factory scavengers. Children crawled under operating machinery to collect cotton waste while the machines ran. Getting crushed, caught, or scalped was so common that factory owners budgeted for replacement workers. Scavengers were small children. Their size was the job requirement. They crawled beneath spinning machinery to gather loose cotton fibers and oil drippings, while the equipment operated at full speed. The machines couldn't be stopped because stopping cost money. Children learned to time their movements between machine cycles, dodging mechanical parts that could catch clothing, hair, or limbs. Scalping was frequent. Long hair caught in machinery and ripped scalps off completely. Survivors faced lifelong disfigurement and pain. Many died from shock or infection. Crushed limbs were routine. A moment's mistiming meant hands, arms, or entire bodies caught in gears. Amputation without anesthesia was common treatment. Many children died from the amputations rather than the initial injuries. The children worked 12 to 16-hour shifts, exhausted and struggling to stay alert. Exhaustion made accidents inevitable. Factory owners preferred hiring new children to installing safety equipment. Night soil men. These workers emptied cesspits and privies manually, breathing toxic fumes that could kill instantly. They worked at night when waste wouldn't offend daytime sensibilities, dying in darkness from gases no one understood. Night soil men descended into brick-lined cesspits, filled with human waste accumulated over months or years. They scooped the contents into buckets that were hauled up, often working waist-deep in sewage. The methane and hydrogen sulfide gases in cesspits could kill within seconds. Workers dropped unconscious and drowned in sewage. Rescue attempts often killed the rescuers. The gases were invisible and odorless at lethal concentrations. Even when gases didn't kill immediately, chronic exposure caused respiratory disease, neurological damage, and early death. Night soil men rarely lived past 40. The work was also physically brutal. Lifting bucket after bucket of dense sewage for hours destroyed backs and caused hernias. The work was done in complete darkness or by minimal light to avoid explosions from methane. Infections from contact with sewage were constant. Every scratch or cut risked sepsis. Cholera and typhoid spread rapidly among night soil workers. The men were social pariahs. The smell was so strong that they couldn't enter normal society. They lived in isolated communities, worked at night, and died young. Outcasts doing work society needed but refused to acknowledge. Steel mill puddlers. Puddlers stirred molten iron manually for hours in front of furnaces reaching 3,000 degrees. Heat stroke, burns, lung damage, and heart failure made this one of Victorian industry's deadliest jobs. The puddling process converted pig iron into wrought iron by manually stirring molten metal to remove impurities. Workers used long iron rods to churn hundreds of pounds of liquid metal in furnaces radiating extreme heat. A single shift meant hours standing directly in front of open furnaces. The heat was so intense that workers developed chronic heat exhaustion and heart problems. Many died of heart attacks in their 30s and 40s. Burns were constant. Molten metal splashed, sparks flew, and the iron rods themselves became red hot. Severe burns covered puddlers' arms and faces. Infected burns often proved fatal before antibiotics existed. The work required enormous physical strength. Stirring viscous molten metal for hours was exhausting. Puddlers developed massive upper body strength but destroyed their bodies in the process. Lung damage from breathing furnace fumes and metal particles was universal. Puddlers' lungs filled with scar tissue, reducing capacity and causing early death from respiratory failure. The pay was relatively good because the work was so deadly that maintaining staffing levels required higher wages. Men took the jobs because families needed the money, knowing the work would likely kill them. Rat catchers. Professional rat catchers trapped rodents in sewers, warehouses, and slums where rat populations exploded. Rat bites, disease transmission, and infected wounds made this work deadly, despite seeming less industrial than other Victorian jobs. Rat catchers worked in sewers, basements, and waste areas where rats bred by the thousands. They used traps, trained dogs, and bare hands to catch rats alive for fighting pits or dead for disposal. Rat bites were occupational hazards. The bites themselves caused painful wounds, but the real danger was infection. Without antibiotics, infected rat bites often turned septic, requiring amputation or causing death. Rats carried leptospirosis, transmitted through urine in water rat catchers waded through. The disease caused kidney and liver failure. Many rat catchers died from leptospirosis without understanding what killed them. Weil's disease, another rat-borne illness, caused jaundice and organ failure. Rat catchers developed it at high rates from constant exposure to rat urine and contaminated water. The work also meant constant exposure to other diseases rats carried or transmitted: typhus, plague in some periods, and various parasitic infections. Rat catchers developed chronic respiratory problems from breathing sewer gases and working in poorly ventilated spaces. The cumulative health effects shortened lifespans dramatically. Lime burners. Workers who processed limestone into quicklime breathed caustic dust that destroyed their lungs. The work guaranteed respiratory failure. The only question was how long until you couldn't breathe anymore. Lime burning involved heating limestone to extreme temperatures to create quicklime for construction and industry. Workers loaded kilns, tended fires, and extracted the finished product, all while breathing lime dust and fumes. Quicklime is caustic. Breathing the dust burned lung tissues, creating scar tissue and permanently reducing lung capacity. Every breath at work damaged the lungs further. The process was irreversible. Once lung scarring began, it continued even after leaving the work. Former lime burners died years later from respiratory failure caused by accumulated damage. Skin contact with quicklime caused severe chemical burns. Workers' hands and arms showed permanent scarring from repeated exposure. Eye damage from lime dust caused blindness in many long-term workers. The kilns themselves were dangerous. Structural failures caused collapses that buried workers alive. The intense heat caused burns and exhaustion. Falls into active kilns killed workers instantly. Lime burners knew the work destroyed health. They did it anyway because alternatives were worse. The desperate took jobs that guaranteed slow death over immediate starvation. Workhouse laborers. Workhouse inmates performed brutal labor as punishment for poverty. The work broke bodies and spirits, with deliberately harsh conditions designed to punish the poor for being poor. Oakum picking was common workhouse labor. Workers unraveled old rope fibers by hand for hours daily. The work destroyed fingers, caused chronic pain, and served no purpose beyond punishment. Stone breaking involved crushing stones with hammers all day. The repetitive motion caused permanent joint and muscle damage. Breathing stone dust caused lung disease. The work was pointless, designed to be unpleasant rather than productive. Textile work in workhouses involved dangerous machinery operated without safety measures. Accidents were common. Medical care was minimal. Injured workers unable to work faced reduced rations or expulsion. Workhouse conditions were deliberately terrible to discourage the poor from seeking help. Malnutrition, disease, and overwork killed inmates regularly. The mortality rates in workhouses exceeded outside populations significantly. Children in workhouses faced the same brutal labor as adults. They were given adult work quotas despite smaller size and strength. Many died or were permanently damaged by work their bodies couldn't handle. Purefinders. These workers collected dog feces from streets to sell to tanneries. The work exposed them to diseases from animal waste, plus toxic tanning chemicals they encountered during sales. Purefinders walked streets with baskets, collecting dog droppings used in leather tanning. The work was among the lowest status occupations, taken only by the desperately poor. Constant contact with animal feces caused parasitic infections and disease. Without gloves or protection, purefinders' hands developed chronic infections and sores that never healed properly. The tanneries that bought the pure used it with lime and other caustic chemicals to process leather. Purefinders who delivered their collections breathed toxic tannery fumes and sometimes handled chemicals directly. The pay was terrible, barely enough for survival. Yet competition was fierce among the desperate poor. Purefinders fought over territory and guarded collection areas. The work's social stigma was crushing. Purefinders were treated as lowest of the low, too contaminated and disgusting for normal social interaction. They lived in isolation and poverty, handling waste to survive. Coal miners. Mining claimed thousands of lives annually through explosions, collapses, flooding, and slow death from black lung. Women and children worked underground alongside men in conditions that killed entire families. Tunnel collapses were common, Inadequate support timbers failed under pressure, burying workers alive. Rescue attempts often killed rescuers as additional collapses occurred. Bodies were sometimes left underground when recovery was too dangerous. Gas explosions wiped out entire mine sections. Methane accumulated in poorly ventilated tunnels, then ignited from lamp flames or sparks. Explosions killed everyone nearby instantly and often triggered collapses that killed survivors. Flooding drowned workers trapped in low tunnels. Pumps failed, underground water sources broke through, or surface water flooded mines during storms. Miners trapped by rising water had no escape. Black lung disease killed coal miners slowly over years. Breathing coal dust destroyed lung tissue progressively. Long-term miners developed severe respiratory problems, eventually drowning in their own fluids as lungs failed. Children as young as 5 worked underground as trappers, operating ventilation doors in darkness. Older children pushed coal carts and worked at coal faces. Their developing bodies were permanently damaged by the work. Women hauled coal in baskets on their backs, climbing ladders while carrying loads that often exceeded their body weight. The work caused spinal damage, hernias, and miscarriages. The death toll was staggering. Thousands died annually in British coal mines. Safety improvements came slowly because dead miners were easily replaced by desperate workers. Gunpowder mill workers. Explosions at gunpowder mills killed workers instantly and without warning. Entire factories could explode from a single spark, wiping out everyone inside. The work meant accepting that you might be vaporized without notice. Gunpowder production involved mixing explosive components manually. Workers ground charcoal, sulfur, and saltpeter together, materials that exploded if friction generated enough heat. Every motion risked triggering explosion. Safety measures were minimal to non-existent. Workers wore special shoes to reduce sparks, but most safety precautions focused on preventing explosions from spreading rather than preventing them at all. When explosions occurred, they often destroyed entire facilities. Multiple buildings would explode in sequence as the initial blast triggered others. Witnesses described seeing gunpowder factories disappear in seconds, leaving only craters and body parts. Workers' families lived nearby, sometimes on factory grounds. Explosions killed workers and their families simultaneously. Entire communities could be devastated by single accidents. The explosions left little to bury. Bodies were often vaporized or scattered in small fragments across wide areas. Families had no remains to grieve over. Despite the dangers, the work paid relatively well because maintaining staffing required higher wages. Desperate men took jobs knowing each shift might be their last, gambling their lives against their families' need for income. Lead-glaze pottery workers. Pottery workers who applied lead glazes absorbed poison through their skin and lungs daily. Lead poisoning was inevitable. Death was just a matter of time. Slow, painful, and unavoidable. The glazing process required handling lead compounds constantly. Workers mixed lead powder with water, painted it onto pottery, and breathed lead dust throughout the day. Every task added more lead to their bodies. Early symptoms included abdominal pain, painter's colic, and constipation. Workers developed a grey pallor, gum discoloration, and metallic taste. These were early warnings that worse was coming. As poisoning progressed, workers developed wrist drop, paralysis of hand muscles from nerve damage. Both hands would hang limp, making even simple tasks impossible. The paralysis often became permanent. Kidney failure followed. Lead accumulated in kidneys, gradually destroying them. Workers developed high blood pressure, protein in urine, and eventually complete kidney failure. Death from kidney failure was slow and painful. Brain damage occurred in advanced cases. Lead poisoning caused confusion, seizures, and eventually coma. Some victims developed permanent intellectual disability from lead exposure. Pregnant women who worked with lead glazes frequently miscarried. Those who carried to term often delivered stillborn babies or infants with severe developmental problems. Lead crossed the placenta, poisoning developing fetuses. The pottery industry. New lead glazes were deadly. Alternative lead-free glazes existed, but were more expensive and produced less brilliant finishes. Profits mattered more than workers' lives. Legislation eventually regulated lead glaze use, but enforcement was weak. Workers continued dying from lead poisoning well into the 20th century, victims of preventable poisoning for the sake of cheaper pottery. The human cost. These 15 jobs represent Victorian industrial progress built on workers' lives. The death tolls were known, documented, and largely ignored. Profit mattered more than human life. No comprehensive death counts exist. Victorian record-keeping didn't prioritize worker deaths. Estimates suggest hundreds of thousands died from industrial work, but true numbers are unknown. The victims were disproportionately poor, children, and women, people with no alternatives who took deadly work because starvation was immediate, while death from work was only probable. Legislation came slowly. Factory acts, mine acts, and various safety regulations took decades to implement and longer to enforce. Each reform was resisted by industry claiming regulations would destroy profits. The Victorian jobs that killed workers are largely gone. Modern safety regulations, unions, and worker protections exist because people died in these jobs. The protections workers have today were purchased with Victorian workers' lives. So, which Victorian death job shocks you most? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this look at Victorian working conditions, subscribe for more stories about how people really lived in the past. Thanks for watching.